Professor Camille Parmesan, welcome. Thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day, and thank you for helping to celebrate it.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, you and I have known each other a very, very long time, and I've had great joy in following your career and seeing you not just in the work that you've been doing in your own experimental research, but the way that you've become a real spokesperson for people understanding the realities of climate change and the urgency of understanding climate change. But let's go back a little bit first and get us a little set up. Tell me about when you first became aware of the planet-wide changes that climate change represent.
Well, it was actually while I was doing my field work, and I had started a project funded by NASA that was to look for impacts of climate change. But I started it at a time when the climate scientists were still debating about whether they were seeing global warming. They expected it just from basic physics, basic first principles, but they weren't sure that they were seeing it yet. And so I had put in this proposal to say, well, I've got this butterfly that's really, really sensitive to climate. And if anyone's going to be showing impacts, it's going to be this butterfly. And so I was actually doing field work, not sure what I was going to find, not sure if anything was happening at all. And as I'm traveling around from Mexico to Canada, after about in the second year, I start realizing, they're going extinct down in Mexico, but they're doing fine in Canada. And, they're going extinct near the ocean, but they're doing fine in the high mountains. And it just kind of hit me. Wow, this is it. I'm seeing the impacts of global warming before the climate scientists actually know it's happening. And it was gradual. It wasn't like a sudden light bulb, but as the season's going on, and it really was into that second, maybe even early in the third year of doing field work, that, I was calling home to my husband and saying, I'm going to keep doing the work, I'm going to keep looking, but if this pattern keeps up, this is huge. It means like this entire species is moving northward and upward. It's not some like complex, sophisticated, subtle impact, which is what I was expecting. No, it's just boom, the whole thing is moving up. And that really was, I don't often get astonished when I'm doing field work, but that was pretty astonishing, And then next year, the climate scientists published, the warming trend globally was significant. So it was like our studies got published within a few months of each other. It was really pretty cool.
And your study on this attracted really global attention.
Oh yeah, because there was still such strong debate in the climate community, and because biologists, again, we knew from first principle that of course most wild plants and animals are sensitive to climate. Everyone knows this, right? Your rose bush dies if it's too cold or if it's too dry. But ecologists, biologists weren't expecting to be seeing any impacts for decades. I mean, literally decades. And suddenly I come out with this paper, this, entire species is moving northward and upward across the whole of Western North America. And it was just, wow. And that for a lot of biologists, that was what they needed. They needed a single, really convincing, large geographic area being impacted.
So this is how a biologist becomes a spokesperson in many ways for the realities of climate change by being able to see the effects in an actual species.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And then when I was giving seminars around the world about it, what was interesting is that the conservation biologists were almost the most reluctant to accept it. because, you know, they were used to dealing with invasive species and habitat destruction. And I kept saying to them, look, you do all of that and you don't deal with climate change, you're going to lose it anyway. So you have to take climate change on board. And it took 10 years of going, you know, and this is going to these conservation conferences, 10 years before they turned around. And they turned around because they started seeing the impacts in their favorite species or in their protected area that they were preserving. And suddenly it was real, right? Not just theoretical.
What year was that paper?
My paper was in 1996. And, you know, it was really getting towards the late 2000s before the conservation community started realizing that they had to deal with climate change.
So we're seeing that scientists have been struggling with this question for a long time. It's not
Right.
that it was suddenly apparent and all the scientists all over the world said, you know, we have 100% agreement. There's some struggle there. Has that changed?
I mean, you're right. It's a period of transition when you're gathering the studies and studies are being published and, you know, people are looking for it. Oh, is it just that my butterfly is really climate sensitive? Is this a more general thing? Is it just Western North America? Is it global? And so you've got to kind of start packing up all those studies and getting all that done. And it was the same for the climate scientists. So they came around to agreement earlier than the biologists did because they had been looking at it for much longer. They had a couple more decades of information. But by now, I don't meet any biologist, ecologist, conservation biologist that don't accept that climate change is happening. And not just that it's happening, but it's starting to become the number one threat to preservation of biodiversity.
And what's the best science that indicates that climate change is human-driven?
Oh, it's actually a really cool story because it's not just one piece of science. It's a bunch of different kinds of evidence. And I'll give you the elevator version. It's from basic physics. You know, we know that these molecules that we call greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, even water, they're the simplest term is that they're insulating. Technically it's not the right term, but it's good enough for this purpose that, you know, when you build up these greenhouse gases, that you tend to retain heat on one side of them. And so has been an expectation since the late 1700s that if you increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that it will warm the temperature of the planet. And this is why we can live on this planet. If there weren't greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we couldn't live. So that's actually been known since like 1760 was when it was first discovered. And in the 1800s, a Swedish biologist was saying, or climate scientist, excuse me, was saying, isn't this fantastic? You know, we're pumping out all of this carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, and it's going to warm up the planet, and Sweden is going to be able to grow grapes. I mean, so, you know, it wasn't even considered a negative thing. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1960s, the data set started becoming available that we could see this sharp rise in carbon dioxide. We were actually seeing that we were definitely increasing it, by how much. And that was predicted in the 1960s that about 1970s, 1980s, that this would be warming the planet. And I think actually the prediction went further than that, and it's been pretty spot on. So from basic physical principles, we've warmed as much as you would expect going back before the warming actually began. And the next thing is that the warming we're getting now really is off the charts. If you look at the records for the past several thousand years, it's just way above and beyond what we call natural variability, sort of the natural ups and downs that you see over the years. And more than that, if you look at the other types of factors which can affect climate, like solar radiation. So when you get an increase in solar activity, the sun gets more active, it can heat the planet up, right? Because it's literally pumping out more radiation and hitting the planet. And yet, solar activity has actually been declining at the last few decades. So we should be cooling, not warming, if the sun were what we're driving it. And finally, what I think is so cool are these fingerprints in the actual signature of what's happening with our climate, the patterns that we're seeing in the climate change. And one of those patterns is, if you think of greenhouse gases as adding a blanket to the Earth, then the warming should be closest at the surface, right? And if you look at radiosondes that go way up into the upper atmosphere, what you see now is about in the 1970s, the surface temperatures started warming, and they've been doing this, little ups and downs, but basically that. And yet, if you get above that, if you get into the high, up at 30,000, 35,000 feet, they've had a cooling trend. And that's exactly what you expect from increasing this sort of insulating blanket around the surface of the Earth. And it's also the same reason why winters are warming more than summers, because we've increased our blanket, we've increased our insulation, we haven't increased the amount of energy coming in. And, night times are warming more than day. So all of these lines of evidence just fit together beautifully. And I haven't even mentioned the complex modeling that's gone on, because I actually find the real data is so convincing in and of itself. You don't need to even go to the level of these sophisticated models. And you put it all together, and there's simply no doubt. And in fact, the last IPCC report stated that warming of the climate system is virtually certain, and it is highly likely that this is due to human activities. Very, very strong statement, very strong consensus of the global community of climate scientists.
And this is scientists across many different fields, right, that have come together in the IPCC, which you are actively a member in and an author of IPCC reports.
Very much.
So tell us a little bit about IPCC and your involvement. How did you get involved, and what is its role in this moment?
Well, it was devised by climate scientists, by the World Meteorological Organization, actually, and it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And for, a good decade, really, it was assessing only the climate science, the data, the modeling, the atmospheric changes. And then after about a decade, when they started realizing they were finding something very significant going on, they started bringing in the impacts people, of which I'm one. But not just biologists, people who work on hurricanes, people who work on glaciers, economists, health professionals, really all the other disciplines that are impacted by changing climate. And I got involved because of that single paper in 1996 where I said this butterfly is moving northward and upward. I gave a talk at the White House shortly after it was published. And while I was there, a guy came up to me and said, I'm heading this group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we'd like you to be an author. And I'm like, I guess, what's the commitment, And it's no pay, by the way. This is all volunteer time. And I said yes. And I started working within the next few months. And I was a postdoc. And everyone else was what we call a silverback. Everyone else was older, white, male, very senior. There were hardly any women. There were about 3 women out of, we're talking 200 and some people, right? About 3 women, and very, very little diversity. And now, that was, back in 1997. Now, I'm still in IPCC, and now it's like, it's easily half or more women, all kinds of age groups. They've really diversified the age groups as well as the gender, and culturally much, much more diverse than it used to be. So it has grown, and now I think we're almost 300 people. And it's been really good because we're bringing in issues of equity and justice that really wasn't a topic back in, the late 1990s. So it's been good. It's growing in a very good direction.
So the IPCC reports have been very important in helping governments understand what climate change is all about and what some of the what needs to be done. Although, as I understand it, in the past, IPCC hasn't tried to give specific legislative recommendations, but they have set guidelines. So, tell me if I'm right. The overall goal is no more than a 2 degree Celsius increase in global temperatures, which is obviously going to vary in different areas, but as a global target. And actually, the recommendation that 2 degrees is a real maximum. The actual recommendation is 1.5 degrees. So it's an auspicious target. What needs to be done in order to actually reach those kinds of targets?
Well, first we have to step back and remember that we've already had more than 1 degree centigrade. So if you're talking about a 2 degree centigrade target by the end of this century, we've already are halfway there. And greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. We have not even stabilized, much less started going down. A lot of scientists are starting to believe that 1.5 is not realistic, but we have been told that we have to keep that in. Whether or not we think it's realistic, it's got to be in because that is an official internationally agreed target. And IPCC, the mantra is to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So we're very, very careful to not say you should do this or you need to do that, but to provide a set of options. If you do this, then here's the result, based on the best science we have. If you do that, then this is the result. And certainly we're not telling them how to achieve those targets. But what's really interesting is, this is the third report that I've been heavily involved in, and it's now the 6th assessment report. And for the first time in our scoping documents, which is what the government's put together, we were really pushed to provide more solutions. And like, okay, we're not supposed to be policy prescriptive, but you want us to provide solutions. How do we do this? So we're doing it by really just extending the options that we present and saying, look, if you want to achieve 1.5, these are the steps you're going to have to take. If you're trying to stay under 2, then these are the steps you're going to take. If we get over 2, then here are the consequences of doing that for these different sectors. And so we're still working hard to stay relevant rather than prescriptive. But it's interesting to me that the governments are getting more and more desperate because they don't know what to do. And they want more input. They want more ideas. They want more tools in the toolbox. And that, to some extent, scientists can provide that. But to another extent, basically the best thing we can do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? All the post hoc strategies that we can come up with are just kind of damage control. They're not really achieving what the Paris Accords were trying for, which is preventing dangerous climate change in the first place. And at this point, as I said, a lot of people don't think 1.5 is even feasible. So let's think about 2 degrees by the end of the century. Even if we're trying for that, we no longer can just do reduction of emissions. Now remember, we haven't done reduction of emissions yet to any great degree. We're still ramping up on a global scale. Individual countries have reduced their emissions. Great Britain has done a good job. Europe as a whole has done a good job. But globally, we're still ramping up because, as some of the developed countries get better at their emissions controls, then developing countries, want the same standard of living that we all have, and so their emissions go up. And so since emissions keep going up, at this point, we are committed to a certain level of climate change. And the only way of getting to 2 degrees, only getting to 2 degrees rather than going over that, is we have to start sucking up the greenhouse gases. How do you do that? The best way of doing that is right behind me. Natural systems. Plants. Plants suck up carbon dioxide. Plants suck up nitrous oxide. And any technological solution, I mean, you can get a scrubber, a machine that you can put into the atmosphere and it will suck up the carbon dioxide. And that's, effectively that's what you have on some power plants to capture the carbon dioxide, right? But the scale to actually do that on a global level for the Earth's atmosphere, you would be taking a continent. The machine would be the size of a continent. So, people say, oh, technology will fix it all. It's like, well, the best technology we have is just, you can only do it in the lab on a small scale. So at this point, what we're realizing is that, the other working group, which deals with mitigation, which is how do you reduce emissions, they've got their work cut out for them. But as a biologist, what I'm starting to stress is we need to get nature in better shape to help us soak up what we've already put out. And we can do that in so many different ways. Partly it's just getting our ecosystems to be healthier. People look at a green space and they say, oh, it's green, it must be healthy. No, that doesn't mean it's healthy. Healthy means you have a lot of different species. Healthy means you've got it functioning really well and sucking up a lot of carbon and putting it into roots in the soil and putting it into biomass. And it's something that does take, for a lot of systems at this point, a level of management. In some areas, we can just leave things to recover on their own. But for an awful lot of systems, like, it used to be a cornfield, we've abandoned it. That's a really trash piece of land. We don't want that situation. We want to have a much more vibrant, functioning ecosystem there. And to do that, we have to put some work into it. So a lot of what are called nature-based solutions are not just protecting pristine areas, because we don't have a lot of those left. I mean, we need to protect them, but we also need to go into degraded areas and restore them and get their functioning back. And the difficulty is with climate change, so here's climate change all the time. Climate change is moving on. And so when you think of restoring a system, say it was a cornfield, you've abandoned it because it's no longer economically viable to produce corn there. You want to restore it back to a native prairie, but climate is changing. It's getting hotter and drier, so what species do you put back there? So even the act of restoration that we actually can do really well. I mean, ecology has just made amazing strides. We can restore tropical rainforest. We can restore mangroves. We can restore wetlands. But that's all kind of assuming everything's stable. And you've got this climate change. It starts becoming tricky even to figure out how do you restore a system. You don't always want to go back to what it was historically. You want it to go back to something healthy and diverse that will actually make it into the next century.
Well, here on the Pacific Northwest and in the West Coast, we've been dealing a lot with wildfires, which many people are assuming is part of the consequence of climate change. So are you suggesting that the restoration efforts that we could be making, that we could be encouraging in our own communities, could be an aid in combating climate change?
Oh, absolutely. And you're spot on. Western North America is one of the places in the globe that we've got good enough data to really be able to say the increase in fire frequency and increase in burned area is related to human-driven climate change. So yes, you're right. It is partly due to climate change, partly also due, in some areas it is forest management has increased the fuel load. But as we're restoring, if you've got a swatch of burned hillside, you need to get something back there, or else you're just going to have massive loss of soil. In the next big rain, you just lose it all. And once you lose that topsoil, and you get down to the lower soils, you've lost a lot of your richest soil. So you want to get something in there, but the question is, what do you put in? And that really you need some expertise to say, well, maybe we don't want to put in exactly the same species, or maybe we want to try to get some genes, some genetic types, varieties of the same species from areas that are from climates that we're going into, right? So you're in northern Oregon, you might want to pick some seeds from northern California, right? From further south than where you are. But communities can be a huge help, because the biggest cost of restoration, the absolute biggest cost of it, is labor. Labor for people to go in and plant the seeds or the trees or the seedlings. Labor to go in and weed out the exotic species as you're trying to get this sort of more native forest established. And I just think that would be such a fun thing for a community to do, to pick an area that was badly burned and say, okay, let's help get this back in good shape.
Well, as I've told you, this is a community that really cares about getting involved and making a difference. So that's an amazing suggestion right there. Do you have a particular organization that you can suggest for us?
I would first go to some of your local chapters of, say, the Nature Conservancy. They would have some good input. I would talk to whoever is running the local forestry service, so a government level agency, to get their input onto what kind of species might go in. I mean, you definitely want some experts. I guess in your part of the world, it mostly would be restoring forest, right? Because in other areas, what you're trying to restore is peatland or prairie or whatever. But if you're restoring forest, then you do want people who can give you advice. I mean, and you want some climate scientists who can tell you where the climate's going in that area. And you want to look at where is it going in the next 100 years, climate-wise. And of course, the projections are variable, but you'll have some bounds. Say, okay, it's not going to be drier than this and it's not going to be hotter than that. And within those bounds, well, maybe you can pick a mix of species or varieties that can bed hedge. And not all of them are going to make it, but you want to get some diversity in so that those that do make it can then take over and you can have a productive ecosystem at the end of it. The expertise should be relatively easy to find within the Forestry Service, within the National Park Service, with some of the NGOs who have good relations in your part of the world. And it doesn't take them that long to provide some expertise. Like I said, the real difficulty is the actual, finding the seeds or the seedlings. Where do you purchasing them, and then planting. I mean, you've seen the burned areas. They're huge. That's a lot of work. And yet, if you get, even 20 people together, it doesn't take that much time.
This is really exciting possibilities, and I thank you. So often when we talk about Earth Day and the environmental work we can do, we get very focused on invasive species. But as you pointed out, it sounds like there's places to move beyond just restoring to what was, to restoring to what needs to be. So great, thank you, Professor Camille Parmesan. So wonderful to speak with you. We didn't even get a chance to talk about what the heck you're doing in southern France, but come home, we need you, except I know that you're doing great work there. And I'm really grateful for you and for the work that you're doing and for this chance to speak with us. Happy Earth
Thank
Day
you.
and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much.